Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is meeting number 2 of the Technical Housing Code Forum and the series on our smaller single family and middle housing strategies from the Housing Option Study and Action Plan. Couple just housekeeping items that we wanted to check in on with you all today. You probably saw an email from me this morning discussing potential, we'd like to reschedule our January and February meeting dates. We did our best to try to look into the future and hope and cross our fingers that those would be good for everybody. We've got some conflicts on the staff side on those dates. So we'd like to see if we could schedule them for, Elizabeth's got them up here on the schedule on the slide, and I also had them in the email, January 25th, which is a week after the original one, and then to move the one that was for February 1st to February 15th. We're trying to get this this first batch of strategies moving and kind of looking at doing that public meeting probably end of February, if we can make it work, so that then we can get those through the adoption process and move to the next bucket. So that's kind of like where our timeline, we're trying to make that all work. So I know Eric was talking to us just right before. He may have a conflict, but may be able to make it work. So if anyone of you all that are on the group, if you want to reach out to me by email, we can try to figure things out. And is there anything else, Elizabeth or Steve, that I should mention about that?
I don't think so. Just that Ron has his hand raised. If you're ready to hear
Sure.
from Ron.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ron.
The January date I can make work. The February date is my wife's birthday, and we are solid with other plans. So
okay.
I won't make that particular date. The week after, week before, whatever you could work out.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Ron. And like I said, the rest of you all, if you'd like, feel free to, if you know now, go ahead. But otherwise, feel free to email me, and we'll coordinate on our end to finalize the dates.
Anyone else should we include on that, or just you?
You could just do me, and then I'll coordinate with everyone else.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. As I mentioned, so we're looking at trying to start our planning efforts for the public presentation of the proposed code amendments that we'll be drafting, staff will be drafting. So like I said, to keep us on that schedule. So I think I kind of covered everything. So if there's any questions, please let me know.
I'll just add quickly, Jackie, sort of related. I know some people have had trouble finding the webinar panelist invitations to these meetings. So just know that it will come as an email from Zoom, not from me, not from Jackie, but for an email from Zoom. And we'll try to time it to come out around the same time that Jackie sends you an email directly, just reminding everyone of the meeting. Just know that, obviously, if you don't receive it, let me know, and we'll get you in. And even if you join using just the general link to this meeting, I can promote you up to panelist. But I think that's for folks who haven't been seeing those invitations, I think it's coming as an email, not a calendar invitation, and it's coming from Zoom. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you.
Okay, that's all I have.
Okay, well, thanks, Jackie. Thanks, Steve. Great. So now that we are all here, first of all, I wanted to thank you all for a really good discussion at last month. I feel like we got to talk about a good deal of different opportunities and ways that we could change the code. And as we come back together and think about what housing types we talked about more last time and what housing types we still have to talk about, just wanted to start with a quick review to remind us of the housing objectives that are in our plan and that we're looking to implement across these 5 So there, there's certainly some strategies we've talked about a little bit more than others. But of these, right, the middle housing and smaller single family development strategies we've been talking about, we really have some great opportunities there to target these middle income households. So that's sort of the 80 to 120% AMI. Also looking at that diversity in housing types, that's sort of the definition of middle housing, but also keeping an eye on tenure. I know we've had a lot of good conversations about how to support homeownership, which is certainly a needed and important part of the housing landscape, but also just keeping in mind that we're looking for a variety there. So if something is more likely to be a rental opportunity, that can provide some value as well. We also, want to make sure that we keep our focus on a range of housing sizes. So certainly has been some interest in, like what is maybe a good entry-level family size home. I know we talked about like a 3-bedroom, 2-bath kind of configuration. That's a great fit for a lot of families or households, right? But especially as we're seeing across the county, across the country, that more and more households are 1 to 2 people, just making up to 60% of all households, in fact, keeping an eye on the fact that there could be some variety to look on either side of that we're not just trying to focus on one size house. We can try to promote a range. So those are probably the 3 objectives that we have, really great opportunities to work on through these strategies. And then also some opportunities around all these to look at how housing can relate to transportation, transit, commercial services, schools, parks. So keeping that in the backs of our minds. And just that, if not every strategy supports every objective, that's fine, but continuing to look at different opportunities, even if it's not something we're seeing currently in the market. Right, that could say that there's an opportunity there, and if we could, introduce some new strategies, that there could be, new folks coming into the scene that could be housed or could find development opportunities there. Any questions there? Just to set the tone. Oh, and just the way that I have my screen, by the way, to present, I'm not. I can't see all of your faces, so feel free with our cozy group size to just jump in with your comments now and as we go along. Okay, well, let us sort of with that in the back of our minds, setting the framework, let's talk about some site mapping, which we had alluded to, we were working on. We had a great opportunity with Jose Alvarez and GIS to get some work started here. This is also just meant as a way to help frame our discussion and also look for some revisions potentially, or more questions. I guess we really want to know what questions can we answer with these maps and what other questions do they raise. But the reason that we looked to do some mapping in the first place, right, is, as you recall, we've had a lot of discussion around sort of what we're terming compact developments. This idea that there are some smaller parcels that are more than an individual lot, but aren't a 20-acre piece of flat dirt. Apparently those don't exist anymore. So these smaller parcels sort of say, 1 to 5 acres, and there's a lot of different opportunities we've talked about what we can do with these parcels, whether that's permitting middle housing outright, changing some lot sizes and density, changing some cottage housing standards, looking at this compact subdivision, or even, whether the answer is some site-specific rezones. But before we tried to answer that question, or to try to add some nuance to answering that question, we really wanted to look at what opportunities exist within our project boundaries, which is the Vancouver UGA, and really at what scale. So are there a lot of these opportunities? Where are they? And what does that information mean about how we can target our code strategies to help those sites really provide housing development that aligns with those housing objectives we're talking about. So I'm a little bit putting Jose on the spot here, but these are the mapping criteria that we came up with. Again, within the Vancouver UGA, with the zones, all the low density zones, but we did exclude R120 for this initial run, just because those parcels tend to be larger to begin with, and given the densities and the standards currently, as well as even things being proposed, those didn't seem as likely to have redevelopment potential. And then we asked to sort parcels into both sort of a smaller size. So for purposes of argument, we picked, or as a starting point, let's just say, we went with this 1/2 acre to 2.5 acres as a smaller size, and then a larger size of 2.5 to 3 acres. And then we used the VBLN categories for vacant, underutilized, and residential with constraints, so that we captured that residential property, and to get some measure of like whether these are developable sites or not. And there's many things that go into that model, and Jose can help answer some questions about that. But Jose, do you have anything you want to say about these criteria before we share the map, and you can introduce it and talk about what we see?
The only thing I would add is in terms of developable, the model, the two categories are vacant and underutilized. Vacant is a parcel that has a building on it, or can have a building on it, that's less than 29,500. That was updated recently when we updated the model. It had been 10,000 for the last 20 years. And then for underutilized, that category has got to be at least 1 acre, and there's a building value per acre threshold, which is about 590,000. So anything below that will show up as underutilized.
Okay, so Jose, what would you like to say about this map? Oh, hand this slide over.
Yeah, I think the criteria has been laid out. The colors there in yellow are the smaller parcels, 1/2 acre to 2.5 acre parcels. And again, these are in the unincorporated Vancouver UGA. The orange is the 2.5 to 5 acres. And again, the range of the zoning from R15 through the R110, excluding the R120. Let's see, is there? Yeah, so the criteria also for the vacant lands model, we exclude tax exempt properties. And so, these are sites that have been identified and categorized, like I said, as either vacant or underutilized. I know that sometimes we don't, there's additional criteria if you're looking to develop these properties that you would do in terms of site selection. I think the majority of these properties would probably have a single family dwelling on them. There are very few properties that are just completely vacant. The majority is underutilized or meets that threshold. I know I've heard from Eric and others about issues with CC&Rs or restrictions that preclude further development, and we don't. The model doesn't get into that level of detail. So those are just some of the additional sort of constraints that have to be identified. But I think as a starting point for discussion purposes, there's seems to be a bit of land there. I think I've got some numbers.
Oh, yeah, I have some of those broken down on the next slides.
Yeah, okay.
So some initial observations. I call this the yes, Virginia, there really is a Santa Claus, right? There are these sites that we've been talking about that are these smaller sites, and they make up a pretty significant portion of the land available for residential development within the county. The totals, Jose, are about 3, right, that you provided, add up to nearly 3,000 acres, which is you know, anywhere from half to 2/3 of the total urban low land that I counted in the Vancouver UGA. So that's not a precise figure, but a significant portion, let's say. But that there certainly are some more questions that stood out to me that, you know, a lot of these might be smaller parcels, so that, you know, we have been thinking about them in terms of individual parcel strategies, but a lot of them appear to be contiguous. Maybe they're part of a single ownership, or they're part of a larger development, like Jose mentioned, that maybe is under CCNR, is to keep those large lots. You know, many already have a single family home on them. And that also, looking at the way they're clustered, you know, particularly around the edges of the UGA, it makes me wonder, like, what kind of infrastructure is available. You know, to Jose's point, like, just because these pop on this map, we're not saying these are shovel ready for development tomorrow. There's probably several reasons that they haven't been developed to date, and potentially these code opportunities can help address some of them. But we did want to just at least make sure that there were some, that we were trying to address an issue that really did exist. A couple of the things I pulled from those numbers, Jose, is that the smaller sites make up almost twice the acreage of the larger sites, so they're more numerous, both in terms of acreage, and then because they're smaller, that means there's more than twice the actual number of these sites, so even more than this pie graph shows. It's about 2,000 acres, 1,900 acres total across the 4 zones in the smaller category, and about 900 odd acres in the larger sites. And then they are distributed throughout the different zones. I combined both the small and large for this pie chart, but the R15 just is a smaller percentage of the land total, so it's a smaller percentage here. R16, R17.5 are a large percentage, and then R110 is a lot of acreage, but it, you know, just given those dimensional standards, that might not necessarily translate to as many lots or as much development potential. And I did combine the small and large just for this pie graph because there wasn't a significant breakdown. Jose, anything else you'd add about these numbers or the way that I misrepresented them?
No, I think you've covered it accurately.
Thank you. So for the group, just wanted to have a chance to maybe hear your impressions of this map. Any questions, or like what questions do you feel this answers, or what additional questions does it raise as we try to refine our strategies? And do we still think that this sort of confirms our idea that cottage housing and compact subdivisions could be the right path, or does it just open up more questions or more opportunities?
Can you put the map up again?
I was just thinking that, yes. And we can send this out as well so that you can ponder it.
That would be really helpful, actually. Yeah, and it just looks like a lot of small dots at the moment.
Right. So, I mean, and that's one finding, like there are a lot of small dots. That is kind of good news in terms of answering the question, but harder to answer more refined questions, perhaps, in this venue.
So what is the exact question you want us to answer or comment on?
Yeah, does this map help address our question about, you know, is there opportunity specific to these smaller development sites that this map helps inform? Does it confirm that we're on the right track with cottage housing and compact subdivisions? Or do you have additional questions about the map that could better answer that question?
I mean, I think the map's useful. I think really the devil's going to be in the details. I think we need whatever tools we have and make them practical for, you know, application in the field. And then it's going to kind of work itself out. We're probably going to have to adapt. We're going to try to put our best foot forward and give these options, and then see if the market, you know, bites on them and takes, and then the end consumer, or, you know, the homeowner, you know, if that product's needed in the marketplace, and then we might have to adapt. But I mean, this is great information.
When I look at it, I see that there's a majority of this land is areas that are not served by sewer at the moment, or have some topographic areas. So these are really, they're not developable at this point. They're getting there. There's definitely a sewer going into some of those different areas, or plan to go in some of those areas. So that's my take on it.
Right.
Yeah, you'd really have to get a lot closer to figure the feasibility on each one. Feasibility is pretty complex.
Oh, sure.
There's
And we're
multiple
not,
reasons.
right.
Yep.
And I don't think that we're trying to assess feasibility here, because that is just so complex and site specific and isn't necessarily the charge for our project. I think we just want to say, before we go to a lot of effort in terms of, you know, how we redesign the cottage housing or the compact subdivision, like, are there properties where this could actually apply? And therefore, is it worthwhile to develop these strategies? So, you know, based on this map, my initial answer is yes, it really does look like, you know, we have some of these smaller size parcels.
Yes,
And
there's
then-
definitely these products, these size of lots and projects available if we have the means to be able to do it through the code, as Eric said, with different housing types.
And we're gonna need these strategies regardless of what the map looks like right now. I mean,
Yeah.
we're not thinking about tomorrow. We're talking about the next 20 years. So we're gonna be looking at the comp plan again. And we're gonna take these concepts and strategies that we work on here, and we're gonna apply them across the next comp plan. So yeah, it's definitely needed regardless of the map. One thing I do want to stress though, and it's just more of a concept and an ideology, is that we still need variety of housing types. So just because we want to make sure that even though we're creating these middle housing options, we do still have opportunity for move-up buyers. Because the nice thing about move-up buyers is it creates affordable product out of the stuff that's there now. So you look at existing homes, people move out of that home and move into their larger home that we might be making obsolete. And if they don't have a place to go, they don't move out of that smaller home, or they move to a different community. And we don't want to lose some of our, some of our very productive, people in society here and part of our community that are, I'm thinking doctors, lawyers, high tech, people that really contribute quite a bit. The jobs we're trying to attract, we need a place for them to live too. And they may not want to live in a townhome. So we want to make sure as we're creating these middle housing options, we still have those move up options in our community. And then when they move out of their starter home, that now becomes a middle housing option and affordable housing.
Yeah, can I ask a question? Do you have a sense for the distribution of zones or land types to get to that balance?
I think it's a really good question. It's probably a little tougher to answer. I guess you could look at the income. You could look at our census and you can look at the income, and then you could look at the rough housing price and what that percentage is. And we could look at it that way. I don't know that that's the only way you could do it, but that's the first thing that pops in my head. But it does take some analysis. I don't have the data handy right now, but I feel like there's a way to get there, or a way to at least get close. So, and then the market kind of tells you too. You look at month supply for different size lots and different size homes and what's available in the market right now. I would say a great resource should probably be the Realtors group. The Realtors Association would probably have a lot more information about that they could share. The builders probably would as well, what they're able to build and what they're targeting.
So in that regard, it feels like the market isn't going to show us starter homes for 100% AMI because there is no inventory in that regard. And whether it's townhouses or cottage developments or something like that, if there's an ownership component, then I think, Eric, that does give you that first stepping stone towards that upward mobility that you're referring to. And I think that really feels like the part that we have to try and make sure some of these tools help facilitate that.
Mhm.
We're going to have to get, I think, a bit radical in discussing what could the product look like in that type of zoning to get us there. I think that upward mobility discussion where the houses are already breaking through the $500,000 range. If we look at where that census is on the AMI, that's not people in the median right now. So it feels like this committee was put together primarily because we already saw that this was just nothing but a vacancy without any kind of product available for it. And I think anything that we can do and help facilitate the opportunity to design something like that, that helps us in that 5, 10, 20-year progression then, because we'll have starter home inventory that's down where the workforce housing and the 100% AMI is falling.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's tough to hit that price point regardless. I mean, I met with a client this morning and we were looking at exactly what we're trying to build, or one of the types of things we're trying to build, and it was an R18 zone. It was attached townhomes, about 1,500 square foot, starter homes. They're trying to get it as less expensive as possible while still providing a quality product. So they're maybe not hitting the actual bottom, but they're trying to get something that you would live next to and you'd be like, that's a nice development. So they want to try to get something affordable, but something that's, you know, neighborhood friendly. And their costs, looking at my notes, they're trying to hit 425. And it's actually crazy that that's the bottom of the market. And by building something that small with all the stuff that goes into it, because there's not a lot of land to even build it on, they have to pay a premium. You know, we can help solve that here by creating more options. The permitting cost, all the hoops they have to jump through, impact fees, energy codes, building costs, material costs. It's 425 is their target. And that there's not a lot of profit margin in that. So anything we can do, it all adds up. So yeah, this is a very important effort. So.
Yeah, I think that's, thanks, Eric. That's probably the best transition we're going to get into the code concepts today. So thanks for setting me up. So that's, you know, definitely one of the big opportunities that emerged from our discussion last time, and that frankly had informed our discussion of the strategies throughout the housing options and study action plan. Is that our acronym? And so, you know, yes, we're looking at, well, this says single family detached, but there's also attached options here. So what I'm terming these compact developments, right? So smaller lots, more density, looking at managing some transitions. And so some of the options that we have considered, right, is, or that exist now, right now, we've got the PUD, but that only allows pretty modest density bonuses. And right now you have to use it on sites over 6 acres. That cottage housing track does apply to smaller sites, and it has a pretty appealing density bonus to double the underlying density, along with some clustering and common open space requirements. We're talking about a new compact subdivision option. And then just sort of in the back of our minds, just to keep in mind, like the county did try this twice with a previous infill ordinance. And so just thinking about how we build upon that or learn from what worked and what the new opportunities are. So when we're talking about these compact developments, I think I have a lot of conceptual questions about which of these paths seem most promising. Is it one? Is it multiple? Is each one sort of targeted towards a portion of it? Or is it trying to make each path as broadly applicable as possible? And, you know, going from there, thinking about, you know, certainly the density provisions in cottage housing seem pretty successful. And so, you know, is there a way to introduce that into a PUD option? But also, what else besides density is going to be helpful for these projects? You know, we certainly heard how every little piece adds up in terms of regulations. So it's not about how do we pile on the regulations, but how do we create a compelling package that is both feasible and then, you know, contributes to that. I think you put it well, like homes you would want to live next to. have heard a lot about open space, and this is always a perennial code question of how much open space do you require and what does it look like and where is it located? And it comes down to particularly if we're looking at these smaller sites, there's just only so much site area. So maybe instead of trying to have every different kind of open space, thinking about how are the priorities set between a central open space versus individual yards versus any landscaping around the perimeter or buffering. I guess just a ton of questions here, right? Also thinking about are we trying to encourage a mix of housing types or within each development, or are smaller sites like these more conducive to a single type within one project, and then the mix happens by having multiple projects across the county. And then lastly, just piggybacking on that open space, thinking about transition techniques. So we can come back to some of these for the individual cottage housing, PUDs, and compact subdivision, because the issues are slightly different for each. But I guess I'm curious, I'm interested to hear the relative interest in those three different options that we talked about here, the cottage housing, PUDs, or compact subdivision, and what would help make those work.
I think you need them all.
Yeah, we need them all.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't know exactly, which one is going to be most palatable for the public based on the individual development. But I think for the developer, I don't think we want to rule any of them out as being less desirable at this point in time.
I can tell you what kills them a lot of times, and why people don't move forward with them.
Mhm.
And it can be way too stringent of like design standards. So dictating you need to have alleys if the width is such, changing the size of the garage, where you can have the front door, things like that. A lot of times they're great intentions, but they end up making them not cost effective, and they don't happen. We're dealing with one at the cottage code right now with the garages. There was unintentionally, there was where the garages actually counted towards the livable square footage, and clients just aren't building them now. They started projects, they wouldn't have gone down this path. They would have just built standard R16, R175 product, because they can't build a home that has 2-bedroom, 2-bath like they need, or even 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath is kind of what is the market wants for a family starter home. Even if it is single families, you still want 2 bedrooms typically, unless it's like an ADU, and then you still also want some little bit of a yard for your pets, and we see that in the market a lot. And when you have an alley, you don't have that. You have a garage, you still have to store things, especially in a smaller home. So
Dan,
Yeah.
do you have your hand raised there?
Yeah, and I would add, keeping all the different, keep the stuff as flexible as possible, because as we transition into these non-traditional housing types, one of the things that's going to happen is that the developers are going to get pushback from banks,
Yeah.
because anytime you try something new, it's going to be difficult to get appraisals on them, which means that you're going to have more of, a developer is going to take more risk. And there's not a lot of developers that are really willing to take that much risk, because, there's a lot of capital in these things, and there's only so much time that you can do. I would agree with Eric. What we've seen, I actually did a development to where I had a centrally located common space in an area. I put individual yards that backed up to it, and then I had a portion of it that only had the individual yards. And believe it or not, it became a detriment to my market when I had the common space behind these open lots. I thought it would be a great place to where they have their own little space, and then they actually had a real big area to where we just, instead of making deep lots, we made it a common area and a condominium project, and it was a negative. People did not want to have, people behind them. So individual yard spaces, definitely a key. People want to be able to have, a barbecue outside and have a barbecue and not have it to where they have to do it in an open space that's common to where they have to worry about somebody else's dog coming and stealing their hamburger off their barbecue. So.
I mean, there's a whole commentary on like American social norms too. Yeah. But that's the environment we're working in. So.
And then allowing, you ask a question, Elizabeth, about a different density within a subdivision. I think you could allow that. I don't think you should require it because, again, it's the whole thing about if I'm a developer and I'm required to do 2 or 3 different types of density or housing, that means I now have to be a builder that understands multiple markets. And so what happens is you limit more and more who's able to do that. And you're going to, basically end up kind of forcing the situation that I don't think is the market may not enjoy or like, which means that you have a bigger risk.
Let me get some clarification on that, because the way that you said it, Dan, is different than I was thinking about it. Are we referring to the idea of just having like enforced minimum densities and then the opportunity to have higher densities in the developments, or are you talking about a mix of densities based on the product? Elizabeth?
I was understanding the question of should there be a mix of densities within a development, which I don't think so. And I look at it like I have done that exact thing. In fact, Eric did that development out in Battleground to where I had a big wetland in the middle and I matched the density around it so that I ended up mixed density. Really worked well, but I would say that was because we're pretty unique in that we can develop, there was 2,800 square foot houses in one part of it, and there was 1,300 square foot townhouses in the other part of it. So.
Yeah, that was a traditional like PUD where we wrote our own development standards based on special situations, given that a good portion of that site was critical areas and it was zoned a certain way. So we took the density out even more than a density transfer and did, that was a true PUD in the sense of the intent, where what we're talking about here is actually probably trying to expand it to allow it on a little smaller site, more even like infill sites. So you can kind of, fit these sites that you don't find as many big sites like that anymore. That was a big site. Those are few and far between. You're probably not seeing a lot of PUDs anymore, because of that. So anyway, we need all the tools. Maybe I think the devil's going to be in the details though.
Right. Yeah. So let's get into some of these specifics about, as we get into this compact subdivision. So, and applying these 3 different tools, as I'm thinking about it, some of these projects that we've seen move forward through the cottage code maybe would fit better under this compact subdivision option that we're talking about. So, here's one that we pulled out with, 29 lots. These are all about 2,500 to 3,000 square foot lots. This does have some common spaces, but maybe that could be redone in a compact subdivision. There'd be an option to make those private or public. But, given that they all have street or alley access directly leading to individual garages, maybe this is something that could be, not that it would be excluded from other paths, but this could just be a tool that's really refined to support this style of development. And so if we're thinking about this new compact subdivision, and then sort of looking back and learning from the infill ordinance, thinking about like how broadly should these applicability criteria be written? And like, how should we target this to certain parcels? Should it just be based on parcel size, whether there's infrastructure available, or existing development, so that it's more of a true like infill site? Are there other criteria? Like, what makes this the right tool for a certain site? Especially when you're explaining to the neighbors, why these sites are going to qualify for perhaps, twice as much density as they would otherwise be expecting there.
I would hope we wouldn't be too restrictive about where they can go. I mean, yes, it does, of course, raise questions of explaining to neighbors and decision makers, but
Yeah.
We have an affordability crisis, and so there may be some areas, a short list of areas where they're inappropriate, but I'd say err on the side of allowing them in as many places you can.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Yeah, what about a couple of the things that popped out, on the particular example that I illustrated this with? There were some shared open spaces kind of pushed by the cottage code, but if we're creating this new option under the compact subdivision, what could be some useful open space provisions within it? If, again, I sort of thinking about private yards, common space, or perimeter buffers, what's the right mix there? Or
if I go back to what Dan said earlier in the concept that you still want to have the consideration of individuals having their own space.
Yeah.
Perhaps we need to be looking at it just more on the concept of the dwelling footprint on the individual parcel, and have that as be a comparison that if you want to overshadow the individual lot, then you have to have common space. But otherwise, perhaps it's just a ratio, and we're not going to make a single call of what is or is not an acceptable amount of open space. If you say the development just has to have a certain ratio of available space, and it's done in the form of individual parcels having, let's say it's a 50% footprint of the dwelling onto the parcel, you could get down to a small footprint that's 2 stories and leave enough open space. I think you also really want to ensure for the neighbors, you're still talking about 2 cars fitting into individual lots or being sequestered off of the street.
Mhm.
And you want to be able to show that the people have some sort of frontage that will allow for that to take place. So I am leaning towards the idea of being as flexible as possible towards what kind of standards that we're really even going to be talking about. I think open space could just be considered the idea of what the individual development chooses in that direction.
Yeah. So more flexibility there about where it's located.
Yeah, I think is it Portland that has a code that says, a 50% lot coverage if you're a detached family house, 60% if you're a duplex, and 70% if you're a more than a duplex. So that's one way you can handle that.
Mhm.
Or you could go through, as Ron, I think Ron's idea is spot on. You can go through there and say, well, if you have X square footage per the common open space, then you can go to another 10% lot coverage or 20% lot coverage. So if there's incentives built in that overall the project will have the open space that's required, but you can either make it common or not common.
Mhm. Yeah, great. Ron, you also touched on like parking, and that makes me think of on-street and off-street and street standards. One of the features of these infill ordinances in the past has been allowing some narrower streets. And since then, the county has developed some private road standards that, can address some of these scenarios. But what have we learned in the last 5-10 years of trying to develop on these smaller sites about what kind of street standards can be met, and if there's anything we could build into new compact subdivisions standards that could support that?
I think if you're gonna go with narrow streets, you gotta ensure that there's nobody parking on them.
Mhm.
And the only way you can really do that is to the idea of saying that the house has enough space to provide for 2-car parking. Or if you're doing a lot of common space, then you have a common parking space area with assignments for how
Mhm.
many parking spaces an individual lot is going to get. When it comes to the aspect of a private road, I don't know how Eric or Dan feel about that, but in the past, it seems like when I've seen that, and the roads have been very narrow, it has no appeal to it whatsoever. There's no trees. Sidewalks are sometimes there, most of the time not. And I guess that all comes back to how much we're going to ask for in the beginning, but then to turn it over to the private entity, it feels like it would be more of a detriment in the long run than a positive for the public.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that we're asking out of our roads and our right of ways, you know, from sidewalks and trees to circulation and parking and.
It's
any
always a challenge. It's going to be balancing competing interests. You know, we try to provide some on-street parking where possible and make the roads public if possible as well. If not, then a lot of times you try to put 2 parking stalls out in front of the house. So yeah, even if it's a 1-car garage, you kind of do a 2-car wide driveway so you can get parking. I think Dan mentioned that last time. He does that in all his projects. Unfortunately, sometimes the design standards make that difficult. So it is a challenge, and I don't know that we're going to solve it, but we can try to do our best to balance the competing interests.
Yeah, and I think, you know, knowing that it's a challenge, the question is really just, is there anything we could build into these standards over and above this county's existing street standards that would address any specific challenges or needs of projects this size? So, you know.
Well, I think the driveway things, allowing driveways, allowing the garage to be a little bit wider, that can help.
Okay. All right, let's see. Anything else that we missed, you know, sort of in this compact subdivision before, you know, keep in mind, I'm gonna go out and write some code and bring it back to you at the next meeting. So anything else you want me to consider for this section before we move on?
Is this going to be part of what you're looking at for these small PUDs, Elizabeth, or is small PUD going to be separate?
Separate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, do you have, there was a memo that Deeb did May 13th on the housing action plan. Do you have that? Because it has a lot of the comments that, of the questions you're asking. Some of those were kind of gone through in a Deeb work group, and they were submitted on some of the concerns.
I'm sure that I know that I received it. Just a question of digging it back up.
You know what? I will find it and send it to you.
Okay, that's great. Or even if you CC Jackie, make sure that this, you know, appropriately logged as communication would be perfect.
I'm going to spin off the one I just sent about the dates. So I think you're on there, Jackie and Steve.
Okay.
Great. I see that Brian has his hand raised.
Oh,
Brian
good.
Mattson. Brian Mattson, sorry.
Oh,
Hey,
right.
yeah, you know, I've been listening along, and thanks for everybody carrying this conversation except for me. But Eric, you said allowing the garage doors to be a little wider. And I started thinking, that's only in the Highway 99, right? It has like a garage 50% frontage ratio. I think that's the only spot that you see that is in Highway 99. Is that, and that's off the top of my head. Is that correct? Is that your understanding?
That's one of the only places now.
Okay.
It, however, was brought up in discussion in other codes that I've seen, I think City of Vancouver was considering it. It's been brought up a lot. Anytime you look at these compact developments, you start seeing design standards. And every time you see design standards, it's about garage percentages, alley, if it's not a certain width, things like that. And an alley doesn't necessarily solve the parking issue because no one parks in the garage, and then you don't have a driveway to park in. So it's a trade-off. And then you don't have a backyard and you don't have parking. And there's other, like, it is appropriate in some situations if properly designed, but a lot of the sites don't fit it. So that's it. And I think it came up again a little bit on the cottage code, but indirectly. And it got impacted because when you started counting the garage towards the square footage, it made it not feasible to even have the garage on there. It was such a small garage that it started impacting the feasibility and the parking. So
do you think that that's overly restrictive? Do you, I mean, just, and I'm kind of holding you to your permanent answer here, okay? But do you think that there are architectural features that you can do to limit the prominence of the garage door? I mean, I've seen some pretty nice garage doors out there nowadays.
Yeah, I can show you. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do, and I've got some examples. Just, a flat face, I think tends to look kind of, it does look boring. There's covered porches that end up going under the roofs. I don't know, I've got some examples that are small homes that have a lot of character that actually don't add that much cost to them, and they're still marketable. But most of the time, the builders want to do that. They want to make it look nice. They get a little bit more for it. They're proud of their work. So.
Well, and I would say that, my job as a builder is to create a street appeal that is appropriate to the neighborhood, so I'm not overbuilding or underbuilding the neighborhood. Create a street appeal that does that. Put the finishes within the house that's expected based upon the neighborhood and the street appeal, and set the right price. So those three are aligned so that people don't get shocked with, oh, I'm overbuying for the neighborhood or I'm underbuying for the neighborhood, that they're basically, because I don't want, as I said before, my focus has been upon trying to create housing that people want to buy. I try and avoid selling to investors. So that's where I think that parking standard, and like Eric said, where I'm trying to create a street appeal that works. And the more restrictive I get, as I said last time, the more I'm concerned about when I build a bunch of townhouses, I'm worried about water intrusion, and water intrusion is a huge liability and will put us out of business in a heartbeat.
The garage door width and parking strikes a chord with me. I'm a defender of parking island. If you don't have parking, they're going to park on the streets. They're going to park on the sidewalks. I've seen it 1,000 times. So,
and that's why, that's why, as I said, we try and shoot for three parking spaces per townhouse.
All right. Good considerations. And I think some of this is going to carry through. Probably, well, I won't offer any judgment calls right now. So the next one we want to look at is cottage housing, and maybe by introducing these two new paths, the compact subdivision and then the smaller PUD. Really curious if there are some opportunities to refocus cottage housing on more of a clustered development that, yes, we might have 3 different paths and have more tools available, but that each one might have a primary focus that's a little bit different. So a couple changes, the county has had cottage housing standards for a while. So some of these are iterative refinements and some are sort of redirection. So first is just, expanding it into R120 and R110 zones. Those could be, just larger lots where there could be a chance to cluster a few homes possibly around an existing home, like perhaps some of those ones that we saw on the map. And then we're not proposing, the initial proposal is not any further density increase, but to keep the 200% density, and just pointing out that those modest increases to the density in the base zones are then going to get multiplied through for the cottage housing. So they'll see a slight boost in density And we could look at, further increases if that seems of interest. But really the biggest change we're considering that came up is, maybe we use the cottage cluster code to refocus on smaller cluster housing. So maybe imposing or maybe including a cap on the size of cottage clusters, maybe just one cluster of up to 12 units. So it's really meant for like a lot to be developed. That's really focused around these common open spaces. We know that there's a need to define and clarify what those common open space standards are. So looking forward to hearing some feedback on that. And then possibly balancing that with removing some private open space requirements. That doesn't mean that they couldn't be provided if that's of interest, but just, in terms of where the requirements land. Another sort of more iterative change is looking at allowing attached or detached units, so that a little bit more flexibility, and then taking out some of the discretionary architectural standards. Just makes it a little bit easier. And, Eric, I know you already mentioned, and we've heard it a couple of times here, about the 1,600 square foot size standard and how garages get counted towards that. And I know that issue is at play in the county already, that there are some discussions. And so the direction that we've got is that is not part of our charge to discuss today with these cottage housing changes, that it's being addressed in a separate channel. So
I do want to comment on that, because
Yeah,
that other channel, the other
Uh-huh.
channel said, we don't want to address it here. Let's do it to the housing action study. So we're doing this.
yeah, no, fair. And I've heard both also. Okay, so and Jackie, I don't know if you want to jump in because it has gone both ways. So I'm just aware that the latest direction that's the latest I've been told. Jackie, do you have any other clarifications on that?
That's what my understand. Oh, sorry. I think Oliver is here too. And I know he's been in conversations with community development. So Oliver, were you chiming in?
Yes, Eric, I think the focus here is really to focus on some of the areas that Elizabeth have touched upon. My understanding is that the direction and when this came before the council, at least twice, was that through the biannual code, the next phase is when discussion about the 1,600 square foot and whether that included garage or not should be addressed. So here we are focusing more on, the cottage housing as is currently written and what tweaks do we need to make to it, and maybe moving it into this idea of cottage clusters. So that is my understanding.
So I do think there's some lack of direction, because one thinks the other's doing it and the other one here. I think we should both look at it. I think as a committee, it is critical to the feasibility of cottage housing and whether the code gets changed here. It may get changed before this and then it becomes irrelevant. But I do think that as we look at it, we should weigh in and we should make our recommendation as well. And then if it becomes irrelevant, no harm, no foul. If it is still going, which I suspect it will be, because they're waiting for guidance from this and they want to do them all together, or they may do them all together, then we have that on the record here too. So I say we leave it in. I don't know what upside would be to taking it out and not discussing the whole piece.
So as I hear this discussion, what I'm trying to understand is what is the genuine motivation? If someone was able to explain to me why the standard needed to be maintained or why the standard wasn't relevant to the motive, then it would be easier for me to have an understanding of it. If we're just talking about roof line and impervious surface and using 1,600 square feet as a dwelling footprint, and we're doing it because of stormwater or something of that nature with the rest of impervious surface, then I have a way of making and understanding the problem and making a determination. right now, it just seems to be somebody's best guess on what they think something should look like without telling me why that's the case. So I think having the discussion at whatever level, whomever is charged with this, and if Oliver wants to assign it to a specific group, you're still going to have to explain to me why 1,600 square feet maximum is the right standard. Concerning some of these other items, removing discretionary architectural standards, I think can only be beneficial towards more people doing cottage housing. I don't know whether allowing the mixed of attached or detached will make it more popular. You know, if you had a very large site, then that might make sense. These are mostly small sites. The one that bothers me the most, though, is the idea of capping the cottage clusters at 12 units. If you're able to get density bonuses, and if you want to do small footprint size dwellings, I think you should have the opportunity to put more than 12 on a site if it allows for it. And right now we're artificially constraining it.
Yeah,
And I would go farther than that, what Ron said, because if you limit it to both, there's problematics with one cluster, because I'm doing a cluster right now, little cottage development. It's 2 clusters of 7. So I would only be able to do 1 cluster.
Yeah.
And then at 12 units, if you're doing a cottage development, 12 units is not enough to really spread off the costs of a survey and having an engineer lift the pencil and putting all this different stuff together and do, I mean, a infiltration test is an infiltration test. It doesn't really matter if it's, you know, one on for 12 clusters, or I have to do 2 for 200, or, you know, 3, because it's, you know, $5,000 for 1 and $6,000 for 3. So that's very problematic. One cluster and a minimum and a maximum of 12 units.
Yeah, and you know, I'm glad that we're having this discussion, because that's really sort of the most radical change that was under consideration, and just thinking about, is that a way to refocus cottage housing, or is that not the right direction to go? So we're really open to this feedback. I think that it came out of this question of, could this cottage housing track, if we're going to introduce compact subdivision and possibly the, you know, and the small PUD, could this have more of a focus on clustered development? So this one in the upper right is an existing home. They were able to just cluster a few additional homes around it. The one on the bottom is a proposed, not yet developed, but approved project in our study area. It has the most hilarious name. I think it's called Posh Pockets. So really aiming at an upper market segment. These homes are all over, their listing prices all over $500,000 for like 1,000 square feet. But you know, they really have embraced the cottage concept, the cluster concept here. They've gotten parking off of the individual garages, and so just a different way. You know, even if we're looking at more, I'm not saying this is the only way that cottage clusters should go forward, but just, you know, thinking about how could we look a little bit more broadly about what could be possible under cottages, and how we might cluster them a little bit more. You know, these are some recent examples that have come up. There are some that haven't been proposed yet, right? That we just don't even know about, haven't imagined. So even this bottom one that we're pointing out is like, oh, what can we learn from this? Even that wouldn't meet, you know, some maximum site number of clusters or units. So yeah.
My take on that, Elizabeth, is let's see if when it hits the market, how it does.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to do very well. So
Right.
I think that that's going to be a nice concept, but let's see how it actually hits the market. There's another one over here in Philida that would be probably a much more appropriate because of the location of where it's at.
Yeah.
But
Brian
That-
Matson's
I
had a-
look at that and say, that's probably not a good example because I think it's going to struggle in the marketplace.
Mhm.
both
At that
Brian's have had their
price
hands
point.
raised.
Great.
Both Brian. So Brian Matson, go ahead.
Okay, so my comments go back to I think Ron's comments, and then I think Eric's about the
Yeah.
square footage of the cottage units. If you do just, and this is just a note for clarity, or just a note anyway. If you do want to expand that square footage for the cottages or make it measured on a footprint instead, you're likely may need to raise the height too, because cottage standards limit the height to 25 feet. So the normal height standard is 35, just something to be aware of. Also that Posh Pockets, that was one of mine. I think that the open space, that's what everybody that thinks about a cottage project from at least our side of the counter goes, oh, look at that, right? I also worry that people aren't going to want to carry their groceries in the rain
Yeah.
to the back units, right? But again, I guess we'll see. I think Dan has a point there. That's all I have.
Yeah, no, thanks for the observations. I think there's, a lot of perspectives. And I don't want to say that I'm promoting one version of cottage development more than another, just trying to make sure we consider a range of things. And maybe try to, refine our focus or learn from there. I know, anecdata, I know a, well-intentioned developer on the coast who built a cottage cluster with the clustered parking and doesn't have garages. And despite her personal beliefs in, low car ownership and whatnot, she said, I'd never build a cottage cluster without private garages again, that it just, people don't want to carry their groceries or, whatever other issues.
Brian Snodgrass, go ahead.
Sorry, I've been running in and out. I've got somebody here working on my door. Let's see. In terms of the size limit, I think we had it in there for a couple of reasons. We adopted it about 6 months ago and are now seeing our first proposals come in. One was just on the idea that smaller homes are likely to be more affordable. We recognize that for some consumers and some producers of housing that's not a market they want to get into, but we felt there would still be one, and so far we're seeming to see that. The other reason was as part of the broader discussion with the community, in that we were able to say that you're getting there's doubling of density, but the houses are smaller, so they will produce less vehicle traffic, for instance, than or less demand on schools, say, than a conventional home is likely to do. It's not. I don't think it'd be enough to make up the density increase, but at least they're sort of offsetting directions. And I think so far we're comfortable with where we landed on that. Time will have to tell. It's early days. In terms of the number of clusters, that is tricky. I'm not sure we got that right. We ended up saying you need one cluster for every 12, and you can have a total of 2 of them, so you can have a total of 24. It's hard to tell. We haven't yet had any, we don't know yet, but I think that may have been a little bit overly restrictive. I think it also was part of the public conversation where we didn't, the idea of saying a doubling of density is obviously, going to scare some people. And so if we could say that we kept it on a modest scale, I think it made that conversation a little bit easier, but I think that's something we might want to revisit again in the future. It's still, there's nothing to stop someone from proposing 2 different applications. They would just have to be different applications. That's all. But there may be an argument that we should have allowed more than 24. One of the areas we're kind of struggling with is on the definition of the common courtyard. We were fairly. We weren't too restrictive on the size of it. We ended up saying 200 square feet per unit on that, which is towards the low end of what most jurisdictions do. And that seems fine. I don't think we need a big area, and we don't want to pretend these are necessarily planned unit developments in the exactly same way. We did end up saying they need to be generally square or round, and are now having, having trouble sort of figuring out exactly what that means. So to the extent that can be more clearly, to the extent we can do you can do a better job than we did on that would help. And, I'm not even convinced that some linear courtyards might work well too. I think, these are not sort of active recreational areas. They're sort of definitional, and they're fostering the community and so forth. So I'd hope we could be sort of permissive on that. And maybe on the ones that are more narrow, require some sort of design of something, some sort of showing on the part of the applicant of how it would all work. But I think we could be more flexible there. What else? Yeah, and we're also seeing some of these now we thought we would only get ownership products of subdivisions, but no, there's some people who are interested apparently so far. We'll see in terms of full site plan and renting them out.
Thanks. Yeah, good to the
Hey,
ranges.
I've got a question for the other Brian with a Y. Hey, you seem to know a little more about the background of the cottages. And I was just curious if you guys put any thought in the definition of a cluster. Because our code says that, they define a cluster in like what's 4 to 12 or something, right? But what defines a cluster? So my point is, if you had a group of 9 cottages and then there was a strip of open space between that strip of, somewhere between the 4th and 5th cottage in that strip, would you call those 2 different clusters? I made the interpretation that wasn't 2 different clusters in a previous recommendation I made. But that was because there was right of way surrounding it. And I thought that, hey, these are all a cluster, so to speak, right? Even though they have a little bit of segregation with the open space. Did you guys think about that at all, Brian? I'm just wondering.
I think Brian may have needed to step away, so let's check back in with him when he gets back.
No worries.
Yeah, and Brian, in other city or other codes that I've seen, the clustering kind of comes as the result of defining like whether or not they're oriented towards the open space. And so, yeah, part of that has to do with just the orientation. But I agree, it could be slightly subjective. Speaking of open space though, thoughts about the open space, when I add up all the different pieces of open space, right, as we're looking at making these more feasible and looking, where could we trim this down and maybe add a little more flexibility? My thought is, it looks like some of the key provisions are preserving that common open space as a key component of cottage housing, but maybe the individual spaces don't need to be required. They could be provided. There's also some perimeter landscaping, right, in the setbacks. Any thoughts about how the current standards add up, what that impact on the site is, and how much and whether to scale down or refocus, shall we say?
If you are trying to fill small parcels with cottage housing, the difficulty of finding appropriate open space that isn't just parking lot material, I think, depending upon the size of the parcel, maybe you should look at the idea of what is adjacent. Are there county parks close at hand? Are there schools close at hand? Trails that are maintained by somebody, where if it's within a block or two, maybe they get some sort of relief in the concept of how much open space they have to have. Going back to our earlier discussion, I do think people crave their individual space more than that common space. Not that we should do away with common space, but I do think that there is a potential to look at the idea of what's out in the public domain if you want to use really relatively small parcels and try and get an affordable product that basically is already going to be a shrunk down footprint it becomes an amenity that is already being provided.
Yeah.
Eric and Daniel both have their hands raised. So Eric first.
Real quick, just from my previous notes on what is making cottages difficult right now, it is sometimes geometry and the 20-foot open space where you can put it, having it maybe a little flexible where maybe you have to put 25 in some areas and 15 in others, and trying to move that around because you have geometrical constraints and dimensional constraints on sites. So that's one of them. The other one was the building height, and Brian Mattson mentioned that earlier. I didn't see that in your information, but as you're having smaller units, you may need to go higher up and make it more like a 3-story unit in some cases to get that square footage. And then the big one, and that's why I really feel strong about at least commenting on it as a group, is that garage thing. The way it's written right now, the reason why that's in the biannuals is because it is frozen cottage development. People are not building them right now, even though they're intended to. And from the history of it, it was pretty much a typo. It was unintended language that got carried forward, and we had a definition already in our code for fire code for gross square footage. And what it meant to say was living or typical square footage. So we used a terminology in there that was used for fire code for sprinklers, anything inside a structural wall, inside a structural member, and that definition of covered patio is also included against your square footage, not intended. So I think we really do need to look at it. And those are like the 3 things that are really preventing, they're the impediments to cottage code now.
Thanks, Eric. Daniel?
Yeah, I just wanted to expand on Ron's comment, because I think that, there's almost a need for an incentive. If you only do I think you pulled up one, there was a four cottage development, there should be more flexibility, because as Eric said, it can become very difficult to meet these common spaces that are required to have dimensional elements. Where if you have, 3 acres or 4 acres and you're putting in 40 or 50 cottages, you could do that, but you certainly becomes difficult to do it in a small space, so maybe have some kind of scale to where if it's less than, 10 units, it's this. If it's between 10 and 25, it's this. So
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. An observation about how it has different impacts.
And Elizabeth, this is Oliver. Coming back to the question that Ron asked earlier, I think, and I think this also gets to the observation from Eric. When we were talking about the cottage housing, I think the goal was really to focus on what is the intent of the cottage housing, what is working and what isn't working, and how can we use this opportunity to further refine what is working and what is not working. Why are we not seeing cottage housing being built in Clark County? I think that's really why we're talking about cottage housing. And in broadly speaking, we talked about PUD, we talk about compact subdivision. Within these 3 categories, how can we provide some flexibility that will provide opportunity for builders to be able to do it? And that's really the focus of why we want to take another look at our cottage provision to see how we can modify it to make it more, broadly speaking, acceptable and being able to be built. That's really what the focus should be on how we discuss cottage housing in this context of the housing action plan and the strategies around it. That's what I wanted to add. It's not that we are trying to kick the can down the road on whether garages should be included or not. That's not the reason why I make that observation. My understanding is that council have asked that in the next biannual code that conversation be heard. But I just want to refocus us on the intent of the cottage housing what can we do to see that more of them are being built? Again, I agree that whatever flexibility we can provide, I get the idea that, common open spaces probably might be very difficult as we get into our privacy issues. So I get that, but, the more flexibility we can allow, scale it down on or up, depending on the acreage or whatever we might want to add.
Yeah, thanks for that reframe, Oliver. All right, so speaking of, let's have options, let's have flexibility. So one more is sort of in of these three, we're looking at our expanding the scope of the initial strategies. PUDs were not initially identified as an area for change, maybe just because they haven't been used as much recently, because there aren't sort of the sites that are larger and allow for greater flexibility there. And that's partly because the standards, right? Right now you have to have 6 acres or more to qualify for a PUD. But taking another look here, right? The PUD classically is supposed to provide more flexibility. And so is that another tool that we can revisit, maybe by decreasing the minimum site size? I sort of brainstormed, is it somewhere around 2 acres? Maybe an acre seems a little too small to be able to have much, flexibility in there, but yeah, I'm not attached to 2. Looking at those low and medium density zones, perhaps. One of the other features right now, the PUD, it maxes out at a 10% density bonus. But if we're trying to create a little bit more parity and more flexibility, maybe that's bumping that up to a 50 or 100% density bonus, more analogous to the cottages. And that bonus, right now the standards are pretty specific about what you have to do to earn that bonus. And maybe there's some additional ones about the mix of housing, or just, is it one of these housing types, smaller scale or townhouses or some other housing types that we're looking to add from middle housing that would qualify you for that bonus. Also, open space comes up again, that right now it's a 12% standard of the gross acres. Thinking about whether, how that would play out on a smaller site, and if that could be a barrier, so that might be targeted for these smaller sites, refined. And then thinking about what the perimeter might look like, and also, acknowledging that a PUD is going to come with a discretionary review and more flexible standards. And as we all know, everyone wants both flexibility, but also certainty. So some trade-offs there. So thinking, as we talk through this, do you see an opportunity to add this into our code package? Does this seem like a worthwhile option? I think I framed this as in addition to or in place of some of these others, but I think we've heard so far that more options, more better, sort of the motto for this meeting. And then also, if we go down this path, thinking about the PUD, are some of these standards that we're proposing in the memo heading in the right direction, or should it stay really open-ended? Trying to get that balance of specificity and flexibility to try to help these compact developments get through the smaller PUD option. So interested to hear your feedback on the viability and applicability of this option.
I like the ability to look at doing something like this, especially as you pull up that first map that was put together with, there's a bunch of these smaller projects that are out there available, and they're probably going to have some impact based upon critical areas. So this would give you the flexibility. I totally understand where you're coming from. I don't like doing PUDs because there is not clear-cut criteria to where I know going in that I have met all the code and I can get my entitlements. And since majority of sellers want their money up ahead of time, I want certainty as a developer.
Nice.
So that gets very difficult to do a PUD. I think one of the things I was thinking about this is if there was a way to put in the code that the interpretation will I think there's an interpretation around, or in the code around apartments, it says that if there is any disparity between two codes within this, section, the staff will take the most restrictive. And if we did this and we said the staff will take the most lenient, maybe there's a way to keep that to the flexibility and a little more certainty. One of my notes down here is maybe a small PUD, 50% is probably going to be plenty enough. If you want to do more than that, you go into the cottage. Because if you went into 100%, then we should probably look at restricting the size of houses, much like what we're doing with cottages. So maybe even with the 50%, maybe it's there's some kind of limit on the housing size. We don't want McMansions placed into these things. So try and fit in the neighborhood is what I'm thinking.
Thanks.
Ron?
Yeah, as I saw this, it started to make me think similar to what Dan was saying. It's like this becomes almost a blending between the cottage development and the PUD if you get into the smaller parcels. So one of the things I guess I'm wondering, if I just think back on the cottage, if you had critical areas, you are not in a position of calling the critical areas your common space in a cottage development. Is that correct?
I would need some clarification on that, but I can look into it.
Yeah, okay, because I think that's one of my distinctions on this is within the PUD, you can work around critical areas and still get your design bonus if you meet the other criteria, but the critical areas are able to be part of the design and more or less a common feature, but not considered common space, which would make it important, I think, towards any kind of development ideas. And just as a thought process also, if you wanted to go with a bonus area, it really feels like if we continue to talk about affordability, maybe the mix of units has to have some fairly small scale square footage units available in some fashion, with the regard that based on supply and demand, they would potentially be lower cost entry level if it was a home ownership model.
Thanks, Ron. Brian Matson?
Yeah, hey, Ron, I just wanted to clarify to your question on the PUDs, that 12% open space can be active recreation areas with features like jogging trails, child play equipment, that type of thing. And it can also be passive recreational areas with such as natural protected areas, open spaces with features like trails, benches, signs, and view corridors. So it sounds like it can be either.
Brian Snodgrass?
Oh, let's see, a couple things. In our, I'd had to look it up to confirm, but we don't have in our requirements for cluster that the courtyard be not critical. Maybe we should, maybe we may get pushed on that, but we want it to be as flexible as possible. If it can function, if it can maintain its critical functions, then it can, it can be a courtyard. For PUDs, just might encourage 12% feels like an open space, feels like a fair amount. And so you might want to think about something a little bit smaller, maybe to be a little more flexible, with a demonstration that it be fully usable open space kind of thing. But that does take up a lot of land. And although the 50 to 100% density bonuses sound like a lot up front, because there's no sort of corresponding requirement that the houses be small necessarily. Why not? I think if we're serious about the housing issue, I think that a 50% density bonus could make some sense.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
I had a question too. It's somewhat, maybe it's a discussion for a different day, or maybe I'm misremembering the original recommendation, but wasn't one of the things on the table in the prior phase that the county was considering the state mandate, which I think only applies to cities, but it sounds like the county was for a density bonus for affordable housing. And the state mandate is only couched in terms of for religious institutions. But I just wondered if I'm misremembering that, or was the county considering taking a run at that?
I have to look that up and see whether we are going to be making that. I know we did mention about amending our code to allow for religious institutions, if they want to use their land for affordable housing, something along that line. But I don't think we talked about density bonuses or anything like that. But I may have to take a look at that, and maybe Jackie and I, and maybe even Elizabeth, we can take a look at that to see. I know that conversation came up, but I don't know where we landed.
Yeah, where we ended up on it was we expanded to anybody, not just religious, and the density bonus was limited to 100% for multifamily and 50% for single family. And by statute, affordable is defined in this case as 80% AMI, so it's a fairly generous definition of affordable.
If I recall, I think Jackie, do you have the answer?
I just went back to look at the strategies. I think it was AH6, and we classified it as long-term, so it's probably just not in this batch right now, but something we'll work on in the future, and maybe the next batch after this two groupings.
Thank you. I know we talked about it, but I can't remember. I don't think you're right. I don't think it was on this short-term list.
It's actually AH3, Jackie. It's on the medium list.
Oh, okay. There we go.
For religious institutions.
Right. And then we have
the long term is considering for non-religious institutions.
Right. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, but maybe there is, some opportunity here if we move into a smaller PUD and we talk about this bonus, maybe one of the ways, not the only, but one way to qualify for that bonus would be, for affordable housing that meets those targets. Could be something to look at.
Yeah.
All right. Are we ready for something totally different? I'm moving away from these compact developments. Woohoo!
No. If I may jump in, I think this is all good, and the reason it's all good is that we also have to be thinking about those non-for-profits in terms of some of these, options that we are putting on the table, and we're talking about affordable housing. Some of them may like the idea, as long as we provide that flexibility for them, and they can come in with something that we can review and say, yep, for housing affordability, you're serving some segment that some are not currently serving. So why not?
Great. All right, well, let's round out our discussion. Last major concept for tonight, talking about accessory dwelling units. So I was pleased to get the update from the county. There's been about over 80 urban ADUs. So just in the county, that doesn't include all the, the cities, obviously, as well as there are some additional rural ADUs that have been developed, but that's just the past 4 years. So frankly, those numbers were higher than I expected to see. There's a lot of jurisdictions, both in Clark County, but also, throughout Oregon and the metro area that see single or double digit production pretty low. So something's going right? We know that the county's done some iterative refinements on ADUs and really taken a leadership role on this. So when we initially developed this strategy, it, really was an opportunity to say, are there just, that next nudge that we can take? So probably the two biggest remaining opportunities that we saw, well, maybe three, but the first two that could be really impactful would be looking at further changes to the parking requirements. So the most recent changes to the ADU standards allowed both on-street parking and off-street parking to count towards the requirement of one space. And that could be taken even further by either taking all parking requirements off the table for ADUs, or there are additional targeted reductions that we could do about proximity to transit or affordability or other priorities that come about, can be modeled off some state legislation that isn't a mandate for the county, but still could be, an inspiration. So some opportunities around parking. And then also, sort of a fun opportunity, thinking about looking at 2 ADUs per site, and whether there is a requirement that, one has to be attached, or they can both be detached, or they can both be attached. I think generally more flexibility is good. I would say that, as we move into a world with more middle housing, if we start looking at allowing duplexes and triplexes, there's some logic to allowing additional ADUs, it's the same number of units. But, this idea that people are going to go out and do 2, if you've got 80 ADUs currently, a very small percentage of them are going to be interested and eligible to get a second one. So this can sound like a big change on paper, but probably has, it's really impactful for a few people that can do it, but is not sort of a major housing production strategy in my experience. Another refinement right now, the standards for most size lots are cap the ADU size at a percentage of the primary dwelling, or 800 square feet, whichever is less. And so the idea would be to just create a more level playing field, let every primary dwelling qualify for up to an 800 square foot ADU. That can really help with some equity issues, because it's only the very smallest of dwellings, right, that wouldn't get to 800 square feet. And they're already using the least amount of lot area. So there's plenty of room for an 800 square foot ADU on those kinds of lots. So adding some flexibility there. One thing we talked a little about lot coverage for other middle housing, but one specific strategy around ADUs is giving a bit of a bonus. I think I put 10% here. It could be 5%, it could be 10%. Just that, if you've already developed a site, you might need that extra allowance in order to put that footprint to add the detached ADU if you're going that route. So that could be some flexibility. Common theme, again, there's some discretionary design language around, compatibility and finishing and high quality ADUs. And that could be, difficult to interpret. It may not have caused a lot of problems to date, but always something to clean up. It can also be really helpful. What do you do if you have a home that, maybe is, I don't know, a more craftsman style, and someone wants to add a more modern ADU? It's not necessarily a bad design. It's just different, just like the house next to you might be different. So just adds a little bit more variety. And then we also heard that there are some cases where, especially on really deep lots, that some of the standards that require ADUs to be pushed to the side or the rear of the property can make those properties really difficult to develop. And so thinking about an alternative standard there. So that's the list we came up with, because all the big ones are sort of already taken care of. So curious to get some feedback. I know there's probably a range of experiences and interest with ADUs in this group, but we would love to hear some feedback. I know it's more of a niche product, but thinking about refinements, which of these could be more impactful, or concerns, and anything that we left off this list that you'd like to see, particularly if it could help ADUs be built concomitantly with new homes, so that you get kind of a twofer.
Go ahead, Eric.
One of the big ones is finding a way to do them in the rural area. So a lot of demand, a lot of area to build them. Looking at the code, the way it's set up right now, it's allowed almost everywhere, where it's really tough to put them because of space and parking and all that. In the rural area, there's a lot of demand for them. I know there's some kind of a comp plan or a state rule, but it may be changing. And there's a few other jurisdictions across the state that do allow rural ADUs, so maybe we can see what they did and apply that to Clark County standard.
Okay, thanks.
I think you're spot on a lot of your recommendations, Elizabeth. The only note that I have is that you probably go down to 8-foot separation because that's what the fire code allows, not 10.
Okay. Yeah, good detail.
Elizabeth, this is Oliver. I too like, some of the, if not all the recommendations here. One area that maybe we could, like you suggested, we could allow it, when you're building a brand new home, why not? And, if you have a 10,000 or 20,000 square foot lot, which we know is not likely to redevelop, but may have the space, why not 2? Why not allow 2? So that's my only just initial reaction. And to Eric's suggestions, if there are changes from the state, because right now, during my tenure here, this was the first time we pushed for allowing ADU in the rural area, but attached and not detached. The detached, if we go detached, we will probably be running into density issue. That's why we went with the attached. And there have been push at the legislature to amend that. I know one of our former councillors did testify at the legislature, but we weren't successful. So we kept it attached, ADU, because there is room in the rural area to do it detached. However, we also ran into a problem with our code. One is that we do allow guest house. And then we also allow, but it doesn't happen very often, we allow for placement of a mobile home in the case of a hardship. So that became an issue for us when we were trying to go to the legislature and asking them to allow us to provide for ADU in the rural area as detached. So this issue came up. You allow guest house, you allow placements of mobile home, and you want this all on one lot. We came back pushing our council to eliminate the guest house and the provision of placement of a mobile home, and they said no. So we kept it as attached. Just in terms of background, I'm not saying that they did anything wrong. I'm just making the group know that that was one of the reasons that we weren't successful at the state legislature pushing that we allow a detached ADU in the rural area. But at least for the first time in Clark County, we allow ADU in the rural area, but only as attached, in addition to the guest house and, in the case of medical emergency, to place a mobile home on the same lot.
So someone did some research at CCAR, and they said, let's see, Cowlitz, Lewis, and Thurston counties all allow ADUs, detached ADUs in the rural area. So I don't know if they're under the same state codes. Maybe they're not under the same GMA rules as we are, but it's at least someplace to kind of check to see what they might have done.
You said Cowlitz, Thurston, and what was the third?
Yeah, I actually have some info, and I can maybe have someone do a little more research and get back to you. But Cowlitz, Lewis, and Thurston counties.
Thanks. Yeah,
And,
I know that they're not fully planning under GMA, so.
And that may be the difference, because the way I understood it, and I think I was kind of, working with Oliver a little bit on it, was that they're not specifically prohibited. In the state GMA rules, it's just in the rural area, they counted towards density. So for example, if you had an R5 parcel that was 10 acres, you could actually put another ADU on it without having to go through permitting or go through a division. But it got kind of complicated. So I don't know. I think there's some incentive at the state level to change that to allow them. So it may be something that we just want to think about and maybe lobby for it if possible. And make sure we do the research to make sure that that is actually a state requirement or a state restriction. Maybe it's not. Maybe we can do what those other counties have done.
Yeah,
Ryan?
it's, you know, sorry.
No, go ahead, Elizabeth, and then Ryan has a comment.
Oh, okay. I mean, just to keep us focused, like the reason that these this strategy and these initial recommendations are all focused on urban ADUs is, you know, to return to our project area, we're focused on the Vancouver UGA. So I think that we can take some of these ideas around rural ADUs, but we may be, you know, handing them over to some county colleagues unless we get some other direction. But I would expect us to stay focused on urban areas.
Ryan, and then Ron has a comment too. Sorry, Ron, I didn't see your hand.
This is more of probably the building department issue, but I know some jurisdictions have looked at pre-approving ADU designs and like having a collection of, it'd probably only work with the detached style, but then you just submit a site plan. You could just make that process a little bit easier and faster.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, we have, sorry, Ron, if you want to go before me, that's fine, but we've made that suggestion to architectural firms to just give us what we can provide to builders or to even individual property owners. They can come in here pre-approved and they can just get the permit and go. So that conversation may come back again, but I think it's something that we have thought about.
Well, in this case, me wearing my Wolf Industries hat and doing a lot of ADUs, I think that's a really important part of how we're going to make this turn out effectively. We have a lot more trouble trying to place an ADU in the county than we do in like the city of Vancouver right now. And part of it is just like what Ryan just said. It's like, even though we only have 4 types of buildings and we do the same ones over and over again, every time that we go to do a project in the county, they look at it as if they've never seen it before, and we have to go through every one of the steps over again. So I think that would be really helpful. The other thing about the idea of potentially 2 ADUs, once again, there's other jurisdictions that they only look at the area that's available to place the ADU. They look at setbacks, and some jurisdictions do setback averaging. As long as the encroachment isn't in like an alleyway or the aspect of where somebody has to be able to get transportation through. So a couple of ADUs where it's appropriate, or start out with a new development with an ADU on the property right to begin with. I think those are all very important opportunities. We have a lot more problem with the idea of matching home decor of existing homes when the wording is broad and generalized and people get to make discretionary calls on it. We had 8-inch lap siding on a 1970s house, which we couldn't even find that kind of lap siding anymore. But a particular city wanted to hold us to that specific lap siding, or they weren't going to allow it to go on. And the owner was only concerned that it have lap siding with nothing more. So I think those are all things that could really be beneficial towards it. I think the 800 square foot where appropriate for the size of the house is another one that's just a common sense kind of change. And lastly, if you do go and do this, let's open it up, Oliver, and look at the rural portion of it too, because we get lots of people coming into Wolf. They ask about wanting to put one out in the rural areas. We tell them it has to be attached, and they just go, what the heck? why can't we just say that it has to be within a 1 acre home zone, similar to what you would do with cluster development, but in a smaller basis? And just say, you know, if it's within the 1 acre home parcel, then you can have a detached home. I think there's probably lots of ways to say that this isn't really increasing density. It's putting an ADU on the property like we treat ADUs everywhere else.
Noted. Thank you.
Eric?
I just wanted to comment on Ron's comment. That's a great suggestion. If you're worried about an ADU preventing future development, if you treated it, I mean, just like Ron said, I hadn't thought of that before, but great comment. If you put it close enough to the house to basically act like it would in the urban environment, then no harm, no foul, and it's not having any negative impact on future development when it does develop. So yeah, totally agree with that.
Yeah, thanks. All right, well, we are doing great. We also just as we're wrapping up, we have not finalized some coordination between departments, but to follow up on one of the issues that came up at not last month. Well, I guess technically it was November. Anyways, at our previous meeting, we talked about this review process for triplexes and quadplexes and how maybe some of them are subject to type 2 site plan review now, and then a separate engineering review. And just wanted to confirm that the concept we're working on is moving towards a type 1 site plan review, and whether it's possible to do a concurrent engineering review. So we'll keep working on that and see if we can bring that back to you with some more detail, but wanting to get that right. And then we have just a couple minutes to finish up. So if there's anything that we haven't discussed, anything else you want to make sure that, you know, is in the room as we go out to write some code to come back to you in January. Happy to hear your sort of final wrap up suggestions. And thank you for all the great feedback so far today.
One thing I would ask, I don't know how to do this in the code. And I don't know if it's actually available at the moment, but I had looked quite some time ago at, I think it was called key lots, you know, to where they fit back and forth to where there's a wide portion and a narrow portion. And so that the two lots next to each other, so you can have a wide portion in the front, a narrow portion in the back on one, narrow portion in the front, wide portion in the back, so that you can have some flexibility with your house design and still have quite the nice living area for each individual homeowner. So instead of having just your basic rectangular lots, and I've looked at trying to do that, but this was quite a while I looked at it and it wasn't supported by the code. So just if you could put that in your bag of tricks, appreciate it.
All right, thanks.
Ron has his hand raised.
Yeah, I'm just gonna ask you all to be like really bold with your suggestions on this. Let's really kind of stretch the boundaries on this, because after this group gets done with it, it's going to go to other people, and then it'll go to other people after that. And every time it gets a little bit more conservative. If we really focus in on what we're trying to accomplish in our goals, I think we have to really, as Dan used the word bag of tricks, I think we really have to be bold with the number of tools that we are bringing in that bag. So I would appreciate seeing us with lots of ideas.
Yeah, noted. Thank you. All right, well, if anybody has final comments, I'm still open to hearing them, but otherwise we'll just tell you the next steps is that we're going to see you back here. Sounds so, you know, send Jackie your comments on these dates, but sounds so far like that January 25th meeting will probably work out. Might need to refine the February date. But we'll talk about that, and we'll be back to talk about some code provisions, getting into some actual language. And then aiming towards a public open house once we've worked on this together with the draft code to share some of these concepts towards the end of February. So we're looking forward to those steps as we continue forward boldly. So thank you all for being here today. Appreciate all the ideas, and yeah, we'll get to work. Anything else?
Elizabeth, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, I just wanted to let you know that for some reason my computer screen just went black. So
It is.
yeah, I can't see anything. And so just letting you know that as we wrap up here.
All right, so you won't be able to end the meeting.
I'll try to figure that out. I do know that we have one person in the attendee with their hand raised, but I now can't access that person. So maybe we can get that question or comment through other means while I try to figure out how to get this meeting ended and saved.
Okay, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it looks like it's Chris Cook, our prosecuting attorney. Chris, we don't know how to unmute you because Steve's is down. You might want to maybe email me. She let me know. I think she's got something to say.
I can't speak for her, but she might have something to say about the rural ADU, but I'll let her speak for herself.
Let's see if she wants to, if she has an opportunity to email me, and then I can speak it.
Mhm.
Is there anything in the chat?
I don't know if the attendees can chat. You all know?
No, well, I don't think so.
Okay.
Sorry.
No worries. Let me see if I can get a response from her, at least either way. Okay, looks like. Okay. Okay, rural ADUs. She says here, we can allow them. My research indicates that the courts have required that detached ADUs be counted for density purposes. So that's Chris's thoughts for that.
Perhaps we can get some background on that we can look into, because there might be, I know that there's multiple groups pushing that at the state level right now. And if we can find out what their concerns are, maybe we could help in that lobbying effort. And kind of like Ron said, I think a lot of it, the reason why was because it takes away from density. So it prevents future urban development because you have them too far away from the existing home, and it basically acts as a second home. Well, if you put it close to the home, and it's within a certain footprint or acreage lot that would be appropriate for when it does develop, there's really, no impact. So maybe we can help steer that. So it'd be good to get the background, not just this is the rule. Let's know why, and let's know how we can actually work to change it.
Yeah, we can research that further. My initial involvement with that was that having this as a detached will count towards density, not it's in a sense that you will be putting two homes on a lot. That was part of the reasoning, and that the code that allows one home per 5 acres, or even in the rural center, one home on 1 acre or 2.5, that making it detached, particularly in the rural area, is an increase in density. That was how we came across. It's not preventing that area when it comes into the UGB, for example, inability to develop. So there were density concerns, and I could go back to my research, and I did help one of our councillors that went up to the state to testify on behalf of the county, lobbying that it be detached in the rural area, because there is room That's one of the issue we were arguing. It is sufficient room to do it, but we have these other issues working against us, but we can research it further. And if the state legislature grants amendment to that, we will certainly go along with it. I have no objection at all.
So how is detached additional density, but attached not additional density? They're two still units. It's like saying a duplex or a townhouse is not extra density, but an extra detached home is. The logic's not really there. So we might be able to use that. So it's still additional density either way. It really, it's irrelevant whether it's attached or detached. I really thought, I thought there was some justification for it if it was gonna make future development impractical because it blocked it and it spread it out. But if that's not the case, then there's not really a lot of logic to it.
Yeah, we can research it further, and I too meet with Washington Association of Counties. So this issue may come up there and they may have a position one way or the other. We also have a county lobbyist. If this is an issue that the county wants to pick up again, we have different avenues to